I'm Rachel, 30 years old, and 8 years ago, my mother looked me in the eyes 2 days after my dad's funeral and said, "He left you nothing." I was 22, grieving, broke, and too numb to fight back. At least, that's what she thought. What she didn't know was that I would spend the next several years studying law in silence, uncovering every lie, every dollar she stole, every thread of the betrayal she spun. And when the time was right, I took back everything. I didn't raise my voice once. But I destroyed her legally, completely, and forever. The air still smelled like lilies and stale perfume from the memorial service as I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, staring at the spot on the wall where Dad's old war medals used to hang. He'd died 2 days earlier, a heart attack in the middle of the night, and everything felt wrong, too quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. My mother was already different, cold, efficient. She moved through the house with an eerie calm, throwing out his slippers, boxing up his books, talking to realtors on the phone like it was any other Tuesday. I should have been screaming, crying, but instead, I was frozen, the kind of numb that makes your skin feel like it doesn't fit right. Everyone around me kept saying, "Be strong," but I wasn't strong. I was shattered. And somewhere, beneath the weight of grief and confusion, I felt something else bubbling up, something sharp, almost electric. A flicker of suspicion. A whisper that something wasn't right. But I couldn't name it yet. All I knew was that something inside me broke the day we buried my father, and something darker quietly took its place. The day after we buried him, my mother called me downstairs with that fake softness she used whenever she wanted something, the kind that made my stomach twist. We sat at the dining table, the one Dad had hand-sanded himself, and she placed a neat folder in front of me. "I want to talk to you about the will," she said, her voice rehearsed, too calm. My heart lifted for a split second, because I knew he'd left one. He told me so, more than once, especially after his last hospital stay. But then she looked me dead in the eye and said, "There isn't one. He didn't get around to it." The words hit like a second death. I blinked, stunned, as she slid over some papers, official-looking ones with a lawyer's letterhead, someone I vaguely remembered as a friend of hers from book club. It all felt too convenient, too clean. "You'll understand when you're older," she added, her hand briefly grazing mine in some grotesque gesture of comfort. "He left everything to me. Because I was the one who was always there." I wanted to scream that I was there too. That he told me I'd get the house, the savings, the business. But I was too broken, too raw, and she counted on that. So I nodded, silently, while every word she spoke carved itself into the wall of my memory. Because even then, I knew I'd never forget this moment. And I never did. A few days after that conversation, my mother insisted I speak with her friend, the lawyer whose name had been on the papers she showed me. His voice over the phone was smooth, overly familiar, like someone pretending not to know how deep the knife in your back goes. He assured me that yes, my father died without a will, and that everything defaulted to my mother. "It's unfortunate," he said, as if discussing the weather. "But it's perfectly legal." I asked questions, weak, fumbling ones, and each time, he deflected like he was reading from a script. What caught me off guard was how rehearsed it all felt. No sympathy, no surprise, just a bland monotone designed to pacify. "You're young," he added. "You'll build your own legacy in time." It wasn't just dismissive, it was strategic. And when I hung up, a sick feeling settled into my gut. I remembered seeing him once at a family barbecue years ago, wine glass in hand, his hand resting a little too long on my mother's back. The way they smiled at each other, like they shared a secret. I didn't know the full extent yet, but I knew one thing with certainty: this man wasn't just her lawyer. He was her accomplice. I wanted to believe him, I really did. It would have been easier to just let the grief swallow me whole and move on, like everyone kept telling me to do. But as I lay awake night after night, replaying that phone call in my head, I kept hearing the same things: the certainty in his voice, the timing of the documents, the smugness masked as legal compassion. It didn't sit right. None of it did. But I was 22, fresh out of college, working a retail job, with barely enough money to keep my car running, let alone hire a real lawyer. I kept telling myself maybe I was just emotional, like my mother always said. Too sensitive, too dramatic, too naive to understand how these things work. And yet, every time I passed the empty chair in Dad's office, the locked drawer he used to guard like a dragon, the dusty file boxes labeled with my name, I felt it. A pull in my gut. A silent scream inside my chest. I was crushed. But I wasn't stupid. And deep down, even in my lowest, most broken state, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Nearly a year had passed, and though I'd learned how to move through the motions of daily life, work, bills, pretending to smile, the feeling never left me. Then one cold Thursday morning, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, and something told me to answer. "Rachel?" the man asked, cautious. "It's Mark Ellison, your dad's old accountant." My heart stopped. He said he was closing out old files and just wanted to confirm some details for tax purposes, specifically, how I wanted to handle my inheritance. I laughed, hollow and bitter. "There is no inheritance," I told him. "My dad didn't leave a will." Silence. A beat too long. Then, carefully, he said, "That's not right. I saw it. I was in the room when he signed it. He left almost everything to you, house, savings, business. Except the life insurance, that went to your mom." But he was very clear. My hands started shaking, my throat closing like I couldn't breathe. The world narrowed down to his voice. "Rachel," he said gently, "you need to get a copy of that will. He didn't trust your mother. That's why he left it all to you." And just like that, the numbness cracked, and the grief that had been quietly smoldering turned into something else entirely, something sharp, searing, and impossible to ignore. It was the moment I stopped feeling sad, and started feeling dangerous. The second I hung up with Mark, I felt the rage settle into something colder, a focused kind of fury I'd never known I was capable of. I didn't scream, didn't call my mother, didn't even cry. I just sat there, staring at the wall, as every moment from the past year replayed through a new, brutal lens. The will existed. My father hadn't betrayed me, she had. And not just by lying, but by hiding a legal document, manipulating a grieving daughter, and weaponizing my heartbreak. That night, I tore through every drawer, every locked box, every cabinet in the house I was still living in out of financial necessity. But there was nothing, not a trace of the will. She'd scrubbed it clean. That's when I realized, she hadn't just lied. She'd planned this. Had help. She probably destroyed the original or buried it somewhere legal and obscure, counting on me being too young, too heartbroken, and too poor to ever find it. But what she didn't count on was the fact that she hadn't raised a fool. She raised someone who watched everything, remembered everything, and now, someone who would learn everything. I didn't have the will in hand, not yet. But I knew this much, I was going to find it. And when I did, I wouldn't just take back what was mine, I'd take everything she thought she'd gotten away with. After that night, something in me hardened. I stopped crying. Stopped second-guessing myself. Stopped waiting for justice to fall out of the sky and decided I'd carve it out myself, no matter how long it took. My mother still walked around the house like nothing had happened, sipping her wine, redecorating rooms with money she shouldn't have had, casually planning vacations on my father's ghost. And I played along. I smiled, nodded, pretended to move on. But behind my eyes, something else was growing, cold, calculating, patient. I started reading legal blogs in secret, browsing estate law forums at 3 a.m., learning how wills could be contested, how probate records worked, how fraud left paper trails. My mother thought she'd beaten me because I didn't yell, didn't slam doors, didn't storm off. But I'd learned something she hadn't. Rage burns out fast, but ice cuts deeper. So I put my grief on ice, packed away my rage, and made a quiet vow to myself. I wouldn't just reclaim what she stole. I'd ruin her, methodically, legally, and completely. I knew if I wanted to take her down, I couldn't just rely on instinct. I needed knowledge, credentials, and power she couldn't see coming. So I did something that shocked everyone, including myself. I enrolled in law school. It wasn't glamorous. I didn't go to some prestigious Ivy. I worked full-time at a grim office job during the day, studied at night, and survived on caffeine and grit. No one knew my reason, not my friends, not my professors, and certainly not my mother. She thought I was just trying to get my life back together. And I let her believe that. Meanwhile, I sat through every estate law lecture with a quiet hunger, scribbling down terms like fraudulent suppression, fiduciary duty, and probate fraud like they were weapons. Every time I wanted to quit, and believe me, there were days I could barely keep my eyes open. I pictured her sitting in my father's chair, cashing checks she didn't earn, smiling like she'd won. That image kept me moving. I wasn't just going back to school. I was building an arsenal. Brick by brick, law by law, truth by truth. As the semesters passed, I sharpened my focus like a scalpel. While my classmates were debating criminal defenses or chasing internships at corporate firms, I buried myself in the intricacies of wills, trusts, probate loopholes, and inheritance disputes. I never said a word about why. When professors asked why I was so invested in niche estate litigation, I'd shrug and mutter something about liking the structure. But the truth was darker. I was studying her. Every statute I memorized was a step toward unraveling the scheme she built. I learned how forged documents could be challenged, how probate courts could be petitioned years after a death, how elder financial abuse cases worked, all the angles she never thought I'd know. I even drafted mock cases using fake names that mirrored my real-life situation, turning every assignment into a rehearsal for war. And still, my mother remained blissfully ignorant. She'd call occasionally with hollow updates. New furniture, spa weekends, selling off bits of my father's business, and I'd smile into the phone, my voice sugar-sweet, hiding the blades I was quietly forging. She had no idea that while she was sipping Chardonnay and squandering stolen wealth, her daughter was quietly becoming the one person who could destroy her, legally, thoroughly, and with precision she'd never see coming. While my mother lived loud, brunches with new friends, spa retreats paid for with blood money, social media posts soaked in self-congratulation, I disappeared. Not physically, but socially, emotionally. I became a ghost in my own life. I cut out distractions, kept my circle tight, and made myself forgettable on purpose. No parties, no selfies, no announcements about school or work. I wanted her to think I had faded into insignificance, just a pitiful daughter she could dismiss in past tense. In reality, I was grinding every day, poring over court filings during lunch breaks, pulling county property records on weekends, combing through old tax documents by candlelight. I learned to live with almost nothing, a tiny apartment, cheap meals, no vacations, because every cent I saved, every choice I made, was fuel for the fire I was quietly building. I didn't want revenge that came from rage. I wanted a legacy forged from precision. And the quieter I became, the less she suspected. To her, I was just the poor, bitter girl who couldn't move on. And I let her believe that. Because ghosts don't set off alarms until they're standing right behind you. Once I had the knowledge, I started hunting for proof, and the internet, bless it, never forgets. I began quietly tracing everything, old emails, archived posts, public records, and bank transactions that should have been buried but weren't. I created burner accounts, accessed shared cloud drives from my father's business archives, and combed through years of financial statements she hadn't been careful enough to wipe clean. I found inconsistencies, thousands withdrawn days after my father's death, property transfers disguised as gifts, and messages between her and that sleazy lawyer friend laughing about how easy it had been to shut me out. Then came the social media receipts, Facebook chats, Instagram DMs she never deleted, where she bragged about finally having control of everything, even joking with a friend that the girl got what she deserved. Every screenshot, every PDF, every timestamp became a brick in the wall I was building around her lies. She had no idea that the very arrogance she flaunted online was slowly turning into her own gallows. Because while she thought the digital world was her playground, I was turning it into evidence, line by incriminating line. I had built an arsenal of circumstantial evidence, but I still needed the sword, the will. The actual document she swore didn't exist. I knew she either destroyed it or hid it where she thought no one would know to look. That's when I turned to the one place she never imagined I'd understand how to navigate, the probate court archive. Buried behind arcane login systems and outdated filing software, I spent weeks combing through backlogs, scouring every file ever connected to my father's name. And then one afternoon, buried in a supplemental probate record that had never been fully processed, I found it, his will. A signed, notarized document dated 6 months before he died. It was all there, just like he'd told me, the house, the savings, the business. Left to me, in full, with only the life insurance earmarked for her. My breath caught in my throat. She hadn't destroyed it. She'd just buried it deep enough that only someone who knew exactly what to look for, and why, would ever find it. I printed 3 copies, certified 2, and stored the originals like sacred scripture. Because now, I didn't just have a theory. I had a weapon. And soon, she was going to see it, in court. I didn't rush. That was the hardest part, sitting with the will in my hands, knowing I could blow her world apart in an instant, and still choosing to wait. But I'd come too far to strike blindly. I needed timing. I needed precision. So I watched quietly as she continued living like a queen in a castle that wasn't hers. And then, almost like fate had circled a date on the calendar, it happened. I saw the house listed online. My childhood home. The one she knew wasn't legally hers, being sold under her name, with no mention of me. That was it, the crack I'd been waiting for. Within hours, I filed a notice of interest with the county, freezing the sale and alerting the title company of a pending dispute. It triggered a domino effect she never saw coming. Her realtor panicked, the buyer backed out, and she called me in a fury I hadn't heard since I was a kid. "What did you do?" she demanded. I didn't answer. Instead, I hung up, walked to my file drawer, and pulled out the certified copy of the will. For the first time in nearly a decade, I allowed myself to smile. Because this wasn't just my moment. This was the beginning of her end. The call from her came less than 24 hours after I froze the sale, panicked, shrill, laced with the desperation of someone who just realized they weren't in control anymore. "You're making a mistake," she hissed into the phone, trying to regain the upper hand. "You don't understand how these things work." But I did. Better than she ever expected. I said nothing, just let the silence stretch until she hung up, probably to call that disbarred puppet of a lawyer she still trusted. Meanwhile, the title company contacted me, concerned about the dispute, and I sent them everything: the certified will, my formal affidavit of interest, and a legal brief so clean and thorough it made their legal team go dead quiet. I watched from a distance as the listing vanished, the for sale sign came down, and the frantic phone calls began. She tried to call me again, 5 times in 2 days, but I let them all ring out. I didn't owe her an explanation. What I owed her was justice. And now, after years of silence, her game had finally stalled, frozen by the daughter she thought she had defeated, undone by the will she thought she'd buried. With the house sale dead and her panic rising, I filed my lawsuit. It wasn't just a claim, it was an indictment, a brutal unveiling of every lie, manipulation, and theft she'd committed since the day my father died. My suit named her for fraudulent suppression of a valid will, conversion of inheritance assets, and financial elder abuse. I attached the certified will, timestamped communications between her and her disbarred lawyer friend discussing how to keep it all, financial statements showing the siphoning of business funds into her personal accounts, and even screenshots of her bragging on social media that I'd gotten what I deserved. I subpoenaed the accountant for testimony, filed a motion to halt all property activity in her name, and submitted a request for punitive damages. The response from the court was swift and devastating to her. Her assets were frozen. A court date was scheduled. And suddenly, the woman who once laughed in my face and stole my future couldn't even touch her own bank account without clearance. The look on her face in the first hearing? I'll never forget it. That's when she realized the daughter she dismissed as too emotional had grown into something far more dangerous, a woman with the law on her side and a vengeance that was ice cold and absolutely unstoppable. The moment the discovery process began, her carefully spun lies started unraveling like thread caught in a fire. Her new lawyer, not the disbarred puppet, but someone fresh, expensive, and arrogant, swaggered into the first hearing with all the confidence of someone who assumed I was bluffing. But once the documentation started hitting his desk, the notarized will, the email exchanges, the forensic accounting reports, his confidence visibly cracked. I saw it. The way his jaw clenched tighter each time my attorney spoke. The way he leaned in to whisper frantically to her as I laid out the timeline, clean and brutal. By the second week, he stopped returning her calls. And by the third, he formally withdrew from the case, citing irreconcilable differences. She showed up to the next hearing alone, no counsel, no smirk, just the panicked silence of someone realizing they were neck-deep in a war they no longer had the weapons to fight. She looked at me like she didn't recognize me. And maybe she didn't. Because the daughter she lied to was gone. In her place stood a woman who built her entire life around this moment, and who wasn't done yet. The day of the final hearing, the courtroom felt colder than usual, not in temperature, but in energy. My mother sat at the defendant's table alone, pale, trembling, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too big like she'd shrunk inside of it. The judge called the session to order, and my attorney stood and laid out our final argument, clean and lethal: the valid will, fraud by concealment, financial elder abuse, asset conversion, and emotional distress. Then came the exhibits, every damning piece of evidence projected on the screen, her emails, her banking history, even the message where she said I got what I deserved. She shrank visibly with every slide, and by the time the accountant testified, calmly confirming he'd seen the original will and warned her not to suppress it, her hands were shaking so badly she had to clutch the table to steady them. When the judge looked directly at her and asked if she had any statement to make in her defense, her voice cracked on the first word. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered, before dissolving into full-blown sobs. The courtroom went still. She didn't deny it, couldn't. Because there was nothing left to hide behind. And for the first time since my father's death, I saw her not as the villain who ruined my life, but as a hollow, broken woman drowning in the collapse she built with her own hands. The judge didn't yell. He didn't need to. His words were steady, each syllable a nail driven into the coffin of her defense. He called her actions deliberate, sustained, and malicious, and emphasized how she had not only betrayed the law, but her own daughter. The judgment came swiftly: full transfer of the house deed to me, retroactive inheritance of all business assets with interest, a repayment order for every misused dollar traced back to my father's trust, and substantial punitive damages for emotional and financial abuse. She was ordered to vacate the property within 30 days. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear her breathing change, short, panicked, barely contained. She didn't look at me as the gavel came down, didn't speak, didn't move. And I didn't smile. There was no triumph, no outburst of satisfaction. Just a calm, final exhale. It was over, not because she admitted guilt, but because the truth had finally been given a voice louder than her lies. And in that stillness, justice didn't roar. It echoed, clean, cold, and complete. 30 days passed in silence, not a word from her. No apologies. No resistance. But on the morning of the eviction I arrived early, standing across the street from the house that once held every version of my childhood, the good, the bruised, the broken. A moving truck sat in the driveway, half full. She emerged not in fury, but in fragments, smaller somehow, as if the weight of consequence had physically bent her. Her eyes never met mine, not even when she passed by with a cardboard box full of picture frames she had no right to take. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The sheriff stood nearby, clipboard in hand, watching the process with quiet authority. When she reached the sidewalk, she paused, as if expecting some last-minute reprieve, some sliver of mercy. But none came. She got into the passenger seat of a beat-up car, not the luxury sedan she once flaunted, and drove off without looking back. I stood there, key in hand, heart steady. And as I crossed the threshold of my father's house, now, finally, my house, I felt something lift. Not joy. Not revenge. Just the quiet relief of reclamation. Everything she stole had come home. With the house secured and the weight of that final chapter closing behind me, I turned my attention to the other half of what she'd stolen, the business my father built with his bare hands. The court's ruling gave me full control, but walking back into the office he once ran felt like entering a mausoleum. Everything was stale, mismanaged, dusty, hollow. Most of the original staff was gone, replaced by people my mother brought in to turn profit without purpose. The books were a mess, the morale worse, and the reputation barely hanging on. But I wasn't there to salvage her version of it. I was there to revive his. I cleaned house. Fired those who'd helped her bleed the company dry, rehired old loyal employees where I could, and brought in an ethical accountant to rebuild our financial spine. Slowly, the business began to breathe again. Clients returned. Orders stabilized. And for the first time in years, the office walls echoed with purpose, not panic. I kept a photo of my father on my desk, the one of him in his shop apron, covered in sawdust, smiling like he didn't know how to quit. Every time I hit a roadblock, I looked at that photo and reminded myself, this wasn't just about reclaiming what was lost. It was about honoring what he left behind, and making sure no one ever stole it from me again. As I rebuilt what was mine, her world began to cave in, not in a loud, dramatic collapse, but in slow, suffocating silence. Word spread fast in her social circle, the court ruling, the fraud, the eviction. The same women she used to sip wine with at midweek brunches started declining her calls, one by one. Her name, once associated with class, charm, and success, now triggered whispers and sideways glances. The disbarment of her lawyer friend had made local news, and by association, her lies became public knowledge. The luxury car? Repossessed. The condo she bragged about inheriting? Liquidated to repay court-ordered damages. She moved into a small, worn-down one-bedroom apartment in a part of town she once mocked. No more trips. No more manicures. No more power. Her Facebook, once a curated gallery of staged smiles and passive-aggressive captions, went dark. I didn't gloat, didn't comment. I simply watched, the way someone watches a fire they didn't light but refused to put out. And every now and then, I'd hear from someone who used to know her, usually with a knowing tone, I ran into your mom, she's not doing so well. I'd nod, offer a polite smile, and say nothing. Because what was there to say? Consequences had finally caught up. Her kingdom was gone. And the silence she left behind was deafening. While my mother withered under the weight of public disgrace, the man who helped her orchestrate it, her smug, manipulative lawyer friend, was finally facing his own reckoning. I had reported him the moment I filed the lawsuit, attaching the same emails he once believed would remain private forever, messages openly plotting how to suppress the will, discussions about forging timelines, and brazen jokes about keeping the girl out of it. The state bar opened an investigation quietly, but when the court ruled in my favor and the evidence became part of the public record, they moved fast. I watched the hearing from a bench in the back, not to gloat, but to witness the final crack in the foundation they built together. He stood there, stripped of his arrogance, sweating as the ethics board read out the charges. Misconduct, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. When the ruling came, permanent disbarment, fines, and a public censure, he didn't even argue. He just stood still, deflated, like a man watching the ground give way beneath him. And just like that, the legal weapon she'd trusted most was gone. Another domino down. Another accomplice silenced. And somewhere, I imagined her sitting alone in that cheap apartment, realizing that the man who once promised she'd never face consequences couldn't even save himself. A few weeks after the disbarment, as I sat in my office going over next quarter's projections for the business, I noticed the faint red notification on my personal Facebook, a message request. My stomach tightened before I even clicked it. Her name. No profile picture, no public posts, just a message sitting there like a ghost refusing to stay buried. I stared at it for a long moment before finally opening it. I don't know what you want from me, it read. You've taken everything. Was that enough? No apology. No accountability. Just desperation wrapped in veiled blame. She followed it with, I miss you. I still think of us as family. Can we talk? I stared at the words, searching for something real, something human, but found nothing but hollow echoes of the woman who once looked me in the eye and told me there was no will. I didn't reply. I didn't block her either. I simply archived the message and closed the app. Because she hadn't reached out in remorse. She'd reached out in ruin. And I wasn't there to offer her peace. I was there to make sure she never mistook silence for forgiveness again. A few days after that message, the one I refused to dignify with a reply, I opened the drawer in my desk and pulled out the most important document I'd ever owned. My father's will. Not a copy. The original. Creased from time and court filings, but still intact, still mine. I had it professionally restored, mounted behind UV protective glass, and framed in dark oak, the kind that reminded me of his workshop. I hung it in my home office, just above the bookshelf that once held his favorite novels, now filled with my law texts and business ledgers. It wasn't just a legal document anymore, it was a monument, a reminder that he hadn't abandoned me, that he had tried to protect me, that the woman who tried to erase his final wishes failed. I catch myself looking at it sometimes when the house is quiet, not with anger, but with a strange kind of peace. It's proof that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, can be dug up, dusted off, and set on display for the world to see. And every time I pass it, I think of that night at 22, when she told me to grow up and move on. I did. And now, his legacy, and mine, hang exactly where they belong, in plain sight, untouched by her lies. The years that followed weren't loud or dramatic, they were quiet in the best way. I poured my energy into the business, running it with the values my father lived by, honesty, hard work, and loyalty. The staff respected me, not because I demanded it, but because I earned it. We hit our best quarterly profits in a decade, but I didn't flash it on social media or throw lavish parties. I kept things simple. Real. I renovated the office but left his old desk untouched, like a quiet shrine to the man who taught me everything worth knowing. I hosted annual appreciation dinners for employees, gave back to the community, and even created a small scholarship in his name, for kids like me, who had more grit than guidance. Life became steady, rooted. No more anxiety in the pit of my stomach. No more wondering if justice would ever come. It had. And in its wake, I found not vengeance, but peace. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, not even to her. Because while she sat in a dim apartment, surrounded by silence and consequence, I was living the life she tried to steal. And that was the sweetest, quietest kind of success I could ever ask for. Even as I moved on, the town never quite forgot. Small towns have long memories, and my mother had burned more bridges than she ever realized. I'd be at the grocery store, or attending a Chamber of Commerce meeting, and someone would lean in a little too close and whisper, "Did you hear where she's living now?" Or, "I remember when she used to act like she owned this whole place." Some people spoke with spite, others with pity, but all of them knew the truth. and no one was rewriting it this time. Her reputation, once polished and performative, had become a cautionary tale, a quiet warning passed in murmurs and side glances. A few former friends tried to reconnect with me, awkwardly curious, but I kept my boundaries firm. I wasn't looking to relive the past. I didn't need validation. The whispers weren't about vengeance anymore, they were just echoes, fading reminders of what was taken, what was returned, and what couldn't be undone. And each time I heard them, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt something close to gratitude, that in the end, the truth had its moment, and so did I. The annual appreciation dinner had become more than just a company event, it was tradition, one I'd started to honor my father and everything the business stood for. That year, as I looked out at the room filled with loyal employees, laughter, and stories shared over good food, I felt something I hadn't in years, full circle peace. I gave a short speech, not dramatic or rehearsed, just honest. I talked about values, resilience, and the man who taught me that hard work and integrity mattered more than ego or wealth. I mentioned him by name, my father, and for a moment, the room went still, the kind of quiet that says everyone is listening. Afterward, one of the oldest employees, someone who'd worked with him from the very beginning, came up and said, "He'd be proud, you know. You're doing exactly what he wanted." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Outside, the air was cool and quiet as I locked the office and headed home, a little tired, but grounded. I passed by the framed will in my office one last time before bed, and smiled. This, the legacy, the people, the peace, this was the life she tried to steal from me. And here I was, living it better than she ever could. Somewhere in the quiet that followed that dinner, I finally let go of the last thread I hadn't wanted to admit I was still holding, the hope for an apology. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a soft, tired acknowledgement that she would never say the words I once cried for. She wouldn't admit what she'd done, wouldn't express real remorse, and wouldn't give me the kind of closure that only comes from the guilty confessing they were wrong. And strangely, that realization didn't hurt the way it used to. It felt clean, freeing, because I didn't need it anymore. I had rebuilt everything she broke, my future, my name, my peace, without her help, without her regret. I stopped checking for messages, stopped replaying our last conversation in my head, stopped wondering if she'd ever become the version of herself that I once hoped for. Some people never say sorry. Some people never change. And trying to make sense of that is just another way of letting them live rent-free in your mind. So I let it go. Not for her, but for me. Because the life I built didn't need her apology to be whole. It already was. It didn't happen all at once, the feeling that the war was over. But one afternoon, as I stood in the doorway of the office, sunlight spilling across my father's old workbench and the hum of happy employees filling the space, I realized I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living. Every piece of what he left behind, the house, the business, even the respect tied to his name, was now back where it belonged. And not just preserved, but thriving. His reputation, once nearly buried by her lies, had been restored with every honest deal, every appreciative customer, every quiet decision I made with him in mind. I'd grown from a grieving daughter into something stronger, a protector of legacy, a builder of something lasting. The trauma hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled me. I looked around and saw not what was taken, but what had been rebuilt, sturdier, steadier, and untouchable. And in that moment, I knew, this wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. And I had done it not with rage or recklessness, but with calm, steady resolve, just like he would have wanted. I used to think peace meant forgetting, silence, stillness, moving on. But now I know better. Peace, real peace, isn't quiet. It's loud in its own way. It's the sound of your own footsteps echoing in a house that's finally yours. It's the hum of a business thriving with honest work. It's the steady beat of a heart no longer clenched with anger. It's the laughter of employees, the warm clink of glasses at a community dinner, the rustle of pages as I read beside a window my mother once tried to lock me out of. Peace is presence. It's being here, now, fully, without waiting for someone else to fix what they broke. I didn't get an apology. I didn't get closure in the way stories usually offer it, but I got something better, truth, justice, and the strength to build my life back brick by brick. And every time I walk past that framed will on my wall, I hear it speak without sound, "You were right to fight. You were right to wait. And you were right to win." My mother tried to erase my future. Instead, I carved one she can't touch. And in that, I found peace, not the kind that hides in silence, but the kind that stands tall, unshaken, and unmistakably mine.